Hi, and welcome to the second part of a two-part series on Martin of Tours that I'm giving. This is Brother Logan Isaac of the Hospitallers of St. Martin, and GI Justice is my overall kind of curriculum on human dignity and civil rights for soldiers and veterans. Um, the first episode covered the life of St. Martin of Tours and the biography by Sulpicia Severus. And this one, the second part, is going to cover Martin's legacy, the things that happened after his death, and many of which weren't recorded by Severus, but were um, created and passed on through oral tradition and local communities that were affected by Martin. Martin being the 4th century Bishop of Tours, a soldier saint, one of the first to refuse to fight, who was not martyred, who kind of had to make up a life for himself after this big event that happened on the battlefield or near the battlefield. And if you're interested in knowing anything about the nuts and bolts of Martin's life, see the first part of this series. They're both GI Justice 400 series, which are kind of like theological for Christian soldiers and armed service and Christian faith. But this one is just going to be not necessarily, or it's just going to be the things that kind of emerged after Martin's death, because Severus is not the only person with stories about Martin. And Martin is a subject so broad, I can't cover it in all the time that I had in the world. But a few of these little kind of nuggets merit some brief mention. One story you will only find by going on pilgrimage describes how Martin's body, his corpse, gets from Caen back to Tours, suggesting the simmering tensions between the rural communities he so loved and the urban centers to which he was reluctantly drawn. And here we see a transept window from the Collégiale de Caen Saint Martin, or the collegial church of Saint Martin in Caen. Caen is now you can find on Google Maps, is now Caen Saint Martin. It's where he died on November 8th in 397. In one legend, very likely based on historical fact, the people of Tours came to Caen under the cover of darkness to steal his corpse and bring it back to the city and its cathedral, where he served as bishop. The event is remembered every Martin Mass in a boat parade from Caen to Tours, complete with hushed fishermen dressed in black, followed by fireworks and loud music upon arrival in the city. This image was taken in 2016, which is the 1700th anniversary of the popular date of Martin's birth in 316, even though in the first episode, and still today, the scholarly consensus is 336. And Descendu le Corpse comes from that transept window, that little kind of plaque there at the bottom of the window. Then, according to the legends about St. Martin as well, it was unseasonably warm as the fishermen quietly navigated up the Loire River from Caen to Tours. Despite the late hour, they could see from their boats that white flowers bloomed as Martin's body passed nearby. To this day, across Europe, any brief reprieve from the oncoming winter cold and late fall is referred to as a St. Martin's summer. This explains how flowers were able to bloom in the middle of November, even if Martinian nerds like myself prefer to think it was because nature was giving glory to our patron saint. And I've included here an image of a St. Martin dahlia. And the St. Martin dahlia is an annual that can withstand cold winters or cold weather. And so if you ever hear of St. Martin's summer, that's where it comes from. It's an odd, warm spell during the coming winter, or even in the middle of winter. Then also, it reaches all the way to Scotland. Martin's interests and cult. And Ninian, who was the earliest Christian missionary to Scotland before Columba, uh, Ninian met Martin before leaving for the Isles to convert the Picts in the early 5th century. Ninian's admiration for the Bishop of Tours is evident in the many references to Martin that remain throughout the United Kingdom, including the Abbey of Iona, founded by St. Columba in the 6th century, 200 years later. St. Martin's High Cross, seen here, is the oldest of all Iona's crosses, and its creator likely began planning and manufacture before Columba's death. Despite the infamous weather of the Hebrides, St. Martin's Cross remains to this day. I think it's like 1,200 years or something that it's been standing there. It's the only high cross that's still there, that's been standing, hasn't moved. There's St. John's Cross, which is this big, wide one that fell, and they've now preserved it in the museum at Iona. And Iona itself, the abbey, was, after it fell into disrepair, after the medieval period, it was reinvigorated and rebuilt by a World War One Church of Scotland minister and pacifist by the name of George MacLeod. And to this day, members of the Iona community are referred to as Milites Christi, or Soldiers of Christ. And the Iona Wild Goose Publications is published out of Iona. It's progressive resources for ministers and churches, and it's really quite cool. And Iona is where St. Martin's High Cross remains standing to this day. Martinmas, also known as Old Halloween, is November 11th. Like Thanksgiving, early November is the end of the harvest. It's a time to feast and to prepare for winter. Goose is traditionally served on Martinmas based on a legendary account that doesn't appear in Severus, that Martin hid in a flock of geese from the people of Tours when they came to make him bishop against his will, but he was betrayed by their honking. And so Martin, we roast goose on Martinmas because it's retribution for giving away Martin's location when he was trying to keep from being made bishop. November is also when geese are slaughtered anyway, but typically they're reserved for more wealthy households. Sometimes one of the churches in Tours talked about how for Martinmas they prepare this huge goose feast, tables and tables, and each one has their own goose for the poor in the city of Tours. And I was able to go to one of these kind of soup kitchen days at this St. Gatian's St. Gatian's Church in Tours is oriented to the poor and does this great job, and Martin's Charity is really popular. Also on Martinmas, paper lanterns are also popular, but they're connected more with the dwindling daylight than with anything related to Martin. And this image on the right is from Sweden, where they dress in blue for Martinmas. If you recall from the first episode, Spain and Sweden, for some reason, retain the historical accuracy of Martin's cape being blue rather than red. And then on the left, we have an image of a goose from St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Kalamazoo, Michigan. That's their, it appears on their church bulletin, etc. And so I don't know of any other saint that uses the goose as their symbol. So if it's a goose, it's very likely Martin. And you can go on the Hospitaler's website or on our Flickr account and to see a bunch of other Martinalia, and where gooses appear, that it's Martin. And Martinmas in the United Kingdom and in parts of Europe also serves as the name of an academic term. Martinmas is the fall semester, and Candlemas, right? Yeah, Candlemas is the spring semester. That brings us to Martin's Lent, or also referred many, many years ago as just Advent. It's also known as the 40 Days of St. Martin and St. Martin's Fast. According to St. Gregory of Tours, the celebration of Advent began in the 5th century, when Bishop Perpetuus directed that starting with the feast of St. Martin, 11 November, until Christmas, that one fasts 3 times per week. This practice remained limited to Martin's own diocese until the 6th century, when the Council of Tours in 567 ordered monks to fast every day in the month of December until Christmas. According to Alban Butler, the famous Catholic hagiographer and historian, quote, the first Council of Macon in 581 ordered Advent from St. Martin's to Christmas Day 3 fasting days a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. But the whole term of 40 days was observed with a strict abstinence from flesh meat, end quote. And that's from the Movable Feasts, Fasts, and Other Annual Observances of the Catholic Church, published in 1776. It's also known as Martintide, and you can see it corresponds with the contemporary Advent and the lighting of the four candles in anticipation of Christ's arrival on Christmas. But back in the day, it was just another, it was like Lent in that there was fasting, but it served a different purpose. It hasn't always been Advent. That brings us next to chapel and capella. The Latin word capella means little cape, like a superhero cape. It is also a relic of Martin's uniform that he cut in half in 354 while on assignment in Amiens. Whether it was actually his cape and which half it was is not known, but its value as a contact relic was immeasurable. The earliest uses of the word chapel, like a little church, describe the tent in which Martin's capella was preserved and guarded by monks appointed by the king. So Martin's capella survived for many centuries as a contact relic, and it was then guarded by these monks in what was a tent that would sit beside the Basilica of St. Martin, which could, by the 1700s was quite large. The cloak is first attested to in the royal Merovingian treasury in 679, but it was likely lost in one of the many pillages of Marmoutier Abbey. During the Middle Ages, the relic had been carried by the king into battle and used as a holy relic upon which oaths were sworn. During the reign of Charlemagne, the guardian monks were brought in from their chapels or tents to live within the royal palace, and they were given the title capellani, which evolved into French as chapelain. And that brings us to chaplain, ministers for the church in places of boundaries, like prison walls, the transition from life to death, and war and peace, are all spiritual descendants of those guardian monks. Martin is not just the patron saint of chaplains, he was the first chaplain, bridging church and state during the fraught transition from an era of innocent persecution to an age of ecclesial appropriation and corruption. He was the first monastic bishop, lacking the power of holy orders, but abundant in the authority of the Spirit. Furthermore, he was a public recluse, refusing to condemn the powerful elites to their own ways, as the early ascetics might have been accused of. Rather than enforcing and maintaining boundaries, chaplains transgress and traverse them. Chaplains are a present and persistent reminder that though we don't deserve it, God is with us, in all of us. God can be found in both our friends and our enemies, in things both holy and profane. That God is not just the judge, but the troublemaker as well. Chaplains remind us of all these things. And part of that heritage has continued on to this day. And as I've said before, that Martin said, "I am the soldier of Christ, it is impermissible for me to fight." The boundary between war and peace being kind of broken down. The idea that a soldier doesn't necessarily, is not, being a soldier doesn't make you a fighter, it makes you someone of service. And that some service is violent, and that's in the Latin pugnare, but some service is not. And Martin transgresses that boundary that we set up, especially in the church, between holy peace and unholy war or something. Then we move forward several centuries to the 15th century. Martin Luther was born the day before Martinmas on November 10th in 1483. And it was common to take the name of a saint near whose feast day your birth fell. So Martin Luther was named Martin because he was born the day before Martinmas. He is part of the spiritual heritage from Martin of Tours, and he too was a troublemaker. He stood up to the established church and said that it had been corrupt, that it had lost its ways, and he's the founder of the Protestant Reformation. And you see him here pounding his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. And then finally, Michael King Jr. was born in 1929. He had his name changed by his father in honor of the German troublemaker after his father witnessed the rise of Nazism while on a world tour in 1934. And Martin reminds us our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter the most. And Martin Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God." These are all men of faith who challenged the easy assumptions of both the church and the state. They are reminders, each of them are reminders that God can work in troublemakers, in people that we think are unclean. And it makes me think of Martin Luther becoming vehemently anti-Semitic at the end of his life, or the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. Was an adulterer. And these men, and Martin of Tours as well, was not, the pure and innocent, uh, epitome of Christian piety that we think of. They got their fingers dirty. We could very well add to this list Dietrich Bonhoeffer, um, who also who was Lutheran, following in the theological heritage of Martin Luther, and who knew that to be Christian is to have dirty hands and dirty fingernails, and to not justify those things that we find that we have done, but to work against them with, however we might do it. And so this concludes the second episode, the much briefer episode of the Martin of Tours series. The first one about his biography and his life, and kind of the nuts and bolts of the time of St. Martin and how he fit into it. And in this one, more of the legacy and how his story has continued to evolve over time. I hope you see just a brief glimpse of how much influence that Martin has had over both the church and the secular world. If you want to receive a copy of the English version of The Life of St. Martin, reach out to me or to the Hospitallers, and we'll get you a digital copy before it becomes a paperback. But otherwise, I hope you check us out at hospstmartin.org. That's hospstmartin.org, or Pew Pew HQ, which is kind of the partner with Hospitallers of St. Martin in advancing the human dignity of soldiers and veterans, both within the church and without. I appreciate you listening in, and I hope that you've learned something about Martin, and that you'll reach out if you have any further questions about his life or his legacy.